We are also going to be celebrating and talking about the 92nd Buffalo Soldiers, which is was the oldest African-American unit in the U.S. military, having been started during the Civil War. And then we're going to talk about the 761st Tank Battalion. So I would like to introduce Stan Stokes, who is a very well-known, renowned artist who has painted paintings and murals for 2 presidential libraries, as well as many, many others, and painted this magnificent mural, which was formerly gifted to the Air Museum last night. Stan?
Hello, glad you're here. I wasn't expecting to do this today because Robert Ashby was going to do it. And fortunately, I kind of took a little look at things to refresh my memory this morning. And got out here and said, yeah, you're doing it. So here I am. The mural was formally given over to the Air Museum last night in a really nice ceremony. And fortunately, Robert Ashby was here for that. I did this in 2001. We dedicated it on February 2nd of 2002. It took me the entire year of 2001 to do it. This is acrylic on canvas. This was commissioned by the Tuskegee Airmen Mural Foundation, which was, all the guys that were in it were LA chapter Tuskegee Airmen. So a lot of these guys are Southern California guys, with a lot of the key people nationally on it also. Once I finished this, everybody started talking, well, you gotta do something else, you gotta do more. So I'm doing a book on it, and in the book here, we'll have everybody else that's not on the mural that are important key people to the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, if you don't know, I'll fill you in a little bit. I have no idea how long I'm supposed to talk, so a big hook will come out and drag me off when the appropriate time happens. And if I haven't gotten to the end of the story, just go on the internet and you can read all about it. The Tuskegee Airmen were named Tuskegee Airmen because they all got their wings in Tuskegee, Alabama. There were 2 airfields down there. Moton Field, where they had their primary training, where they would learn the basics of how to fly an airplane. How to take off, land, fly around a little bit without doing too much damage. And that was in a Stearman, like the yellow plane back there. Those were built for it. Those are a very rugged airplane. If you hurt them, they can be repaired really quick. So the guys at Moton Field, which is just a couple of miles outside downtown Tuskegee, Alabama, that's where they got introduced to flying. Once they got to the point where they mastered the Stearman enough, they were taken a few miles down the road to Tuskegee Army Airfield. There they were introduced to the BT-13, affectionately known as the Vibrator. It was a shaky little airplane that actually could teach you a whole lot if you were willing to learn. Once you mastered that airplane, it had fixed landing gear. It was just a basic airplane. There was more of an airplane than Stearman. At that point, they would take you into advanced training into the AT-6 that had retractable landing gear and much more of an airplane. Once you mastered that, you got your wings, you were in the Army Air Corps. For these guys, this was a wholly significant thing. They had never been allowed to even think about it. Benjamin O. Davis, decades beforehand, had this dream of doing it. He had managed to get himself, after growing up in the Army, his father was an officer, he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. All he knew about life was the Army. It took some wrangling, but he got himself into West Point in 1928. Nobody would speak to him, nobody would acknowledge his existence there. He was the only one on campus that roomed alone. Quite frequently, he would go into the mess hall and everybody would shuffle around and make certain there was no place for him to sit. This went on for 4 years. 4 years, he had this pursuit that he had to do it, he had to stick with it. He didn't just stick with it. He graduated number 36 in a class of 300 and something in 1932. So he was in the Army, he was an officer at that point. He continued on and paid attention to how his father had gotten through the whole thing. The Army at that point was desperate to keep blacks from being in command of any whites. So they would shuffle them off to places where they wouldn't have to. The most frequent place was to land them in Tuskegee, at Tuskegee Institute, where they could be professors. They could teach Army stuff, how to, for these students, how you could be in the Army. So he wasn't actually in any command at that posting. They shuffled both he and his father around that way through most of their careers up until the late 30s. Now, in the late 30s, to anybody that was paying attention, it was obvious that we were headed for war. The military had been cut down in the 30s to next to nothing. So there was this big frantic buildup going on. One of the things that they were really lacking in was qualified pilots. That was desperate to get qualified pilots with their wings on them that could handle these airplanes. They started having the thought, well, maybe blacks could do it. And there were a whole lot of people saying, no, don't go there. But as time went on, there were a few people that were really pushing this, really against the current. The civilian pilot training program came along, and the intent was to take young people, young men at that point, that thought they could learn how to fly, put them through primary training, see how they would do. If they did fine, then they could go on, join the Army, and get into basic training with the aircraft. But this was a weeding out process to keep them from being in the Army Air Corps if they weren't going to make it. It took a lot of wrangling, but finally Tuskegee Institute got accredited as a civilian pilot training program. They had had a little airfield there. They were kind of the logical ones. Because of segregation, the Army didn't want to have groups of blacks flying all over the place. A little side thing to this, last October I went to Tuskegee with Rusty Burns, who's one of our local Tuskegee Airmen. They had the grand opening of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site on October 12th. As we were driving into town, Rusty spent the entire year of 1944 there. He graduated, got his wings, his Army wings, in December of 44. As we were driving into town, the actual town, he said, I've never actually been here before. And I kind of looked at him and kind of went, Rusty, you spent a year here. And he said, no, I spent a year a few blocks that way at the Institute. We weren't allowed to come into town. About a year beforehand, a few of the cadets had gone into town. It was a white town. They were promptly arrested. The Army had to come in there with rifles and get them out of jail. And from that point on, they were not allowed to go into town. So this is the setting down there. It was Jim Crow South. Rusty grew up in LA. He went into Jim Crow for the first time and got to experience all of this. And he said some of the guys really couldn't handle it. He was determined to fly, so he just ignored all the stuff that was going on and persevered. The guys that persevered made it. So anyway, you have Moton Field there with the primary training. You have Tuskegee Army Airfield down the road. Tuskegee Army Airfield eventually graduated 992 guys to get their wings to become Army Air Corps pilots. And at that point, they were officers, and half of them wound up going into combat in World War II. A lot of the other half were taken to other places to learn how to fly B-25s, essentially, multi-engine airplanes. But the guys that went overseas, originally it was one squadron that was sent over, the 99th Fighter Squadron. They went to North Africa. They were attached to another fighter group that was a white fighter group. They got moved around a little bit with mixed results. One of the CEOs of one of the groups that they were attached to really just wanted to prove that they couldn't do it and be done with the whole thing. That didn't last too long. They were transferred over to another group where the commanding officer of that group just treated them as guys, his guys. If they were good, they were going to be able to do well. Ultimately, they did well. They got into combat fairly slowly. Most of the first combat was ground attack stuff. There weren't a whole lot of enemy airplanes, Germans and Italians around. But occasionally they would show up. And on one day, they got into a little dogfight with some Germans. And one of the guys had his guns jammed. He would have been the first, but his guns jammed. So fate dealt him that hand. Charlie Hall, flying a P-40, became the first Tuskegee Airman to get a victory. And from that point on, they were kind of on the road to success. Now, the CEO of one of the groups that they were with, even though they were being quite successful at the time, reported back to Washington that they were a failure. And he concocted all kinds of stories as to why he thought they were a failure. So, DC was almost ready to just cut them out of the whole thing, send them back home. And a few people intervened and said, no, that's not the way it was. They've done much, much better than that. So they were allowed to stay. Really, it's kind of, they weren't allowed to stay. A little while down the road, the other 3 squadrons that had been training at Tuskegee got their wings, got up to speed, they were ready for combat. They were kept stateside longer than most groups by a long shot. They were boring holes all over the skies above the South. Most of the time, if they went up for a flight, at this point they were flying P-40s and P-39s that were pretty worn out. Lots of oil leaks and that sort of stuff, so it was very adventurous flying. They would take off from Tuskegee Army Field, they would head out, they would fly over different landmarks, and then they would come back and they would land at Tuskegee Army Airfield. They were not welcome elsewhere. So that was their little world there. Some of them wound up having several hundred hours of doing this, flying around Mississippi and Alabama in the skies, before they were finally deemed ready for combat. They were sent overseas. They all joined up in Italy. At that point, they became the 332nd Fighter Group. Briefly, they were given P-39 Airacobras because the Army thought, well, let's just have them do ground attack and everything. That didn't last all that long. The P-39s were pretty worn out. We have one fellow here, Jeff Harris, who will be flying the Mustang a little bit later. His father was in the group that handed the P-39s over to the 332nd. So the P-39s were pretty worn out at that point. They were given some P-47 Thunderbolts, and there's a real interesting part of this story. All of you know that Tuskegee Airmen, one of their nicknames is the Red Tails. All their Mustangs had red tails. There is a movie being produced right now by George Lucas, and its name is Red Tails. Now, the Red Tails happened because these P-47 Thunderbolts from an entirely different group that had been in combat for quite a while were given over, and this other group was going to go to Mustangs. So they were all flown to Italy and handed over to the 332nd Fighter Group. The group that they came from was the 325th. Their entire tail was painted yellow and black checkerboard, very brightly, so they could be recognized as who they were in the air. So all of a sudden, the 332nd Fighter Group had all these Thunderbolts sitting there with these yellow and black checkerboards covering the tail of the 325th Fighter Group. They couldn't go into combat that way. They had to do something about it and do something really quick because they were going to be in combat with these airplanes in just a matter of days. All of these fighter squadrons were part of the 15th Air Force. The 15th Air Force designated itself by having every airplane in the 15th Air Force have a red nose painted on it. One way or another, something on the nose was painted red. So the color that they had sitting around in the paint cans the most was red. So when the 332nd is looking at these yellow and black checkerboard tails they had to cover up, and they kind of looked over and saw all this red paint, they said, we're going to paint it red. So that's how the red paint happened, and that's how they became the Red Tails. Me, a couple of other people, and you are the only ones that know this story, it seems like. So keep it to yourself. So now they're up to fighter group strength, 4 squadrons. Stepping back a little bit, when they were still flying the P-40s, their first real claim to fame was when we had the landings at Anzio, which was a fairly messy thing. They wound up being in the air over there. And in just a handful of days, I think with a whole bunch of different fighter groups participating, 36 German and Italian airplanes were shot down. Of those 36, they accounted for 13 of them. So they made their first big mark in history. They did well enough that from that point on, they were not going to be summarily dismissed and thrown away in Washington, D.C. They were on the map at that point. So they go into combat. I need to wrap it up. Anyway, they go into combat, they get their Mustangs eventually, and they just did tremendously. There's always been a controversy as to whether or not they lost the bomber. That's immaterial to the whole story. They had a real fight on their hands just to even be there. And being there, they proved that they were as good as anybody else. A P-51 Mustang was the hottest piece of machinery flying in the world, and they excelled in it. And they excelled to the point where they were beating the Germans flying their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. They wound up shooting, I believe it was 109 German airplanes in combat. And the bomber crews just loved to see the Red Tails show up to protect them because they would do a better job than anybody else. If you guys need any more information than this, like I said, go on the internet or wait for my book to come out. We're very close to having the book out. And where's my sign? Richard, get my sign. I have a very extensive website. We even have photos of the grand opening of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. And I'm doing a painting step by step on the website in video form. So if you're interested in any of that, jot that down or see me later. And you'll be informed a whole lot more. But anyway, the number one thing is down the road, sometime this year, buy my book. So now I'm going to turn it over to the next in line, and I'll pass this over to Richard.
Thank you very much. Toward the end of the war, the Germans introduced the their first jet fighter into actual combat, and the Tuskegee Airmen responded by immediately shooting one down. We're now going to talk about the 92nd Buffalo Soldiers. And this, as I said, is the oldest black infantry unit or unit in the U.S. military. They were given the name Buffalo Soldiers by the American Indians because they said their hair reminded them of buffaloes. And they were instrumental in the various Indian wars and were noted for being great cavalrymen. The unit was, I guess, brought back during World War II and was sent originally to North Africa and then to Italy. Now, Spike Lee made a movie called Miracle at St. Anna, and it is a story that takes place in Italy and is about the 92nd Buffalo Soldiers. We have with us today Laz Alonso, who is one of the stars in the movie, and played Corporal Hector Negron. And by the way, this movie is for sale in our gift shop, and if you buy it, you'll get a free poster, and Laz will autograph it for you. So I'm going to turn this over to Laz Alonso.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to stand amongst all of these heroes in one room. Makes me proud to be an American and to have done this film. For me, it was, as I said, it was quite an honor to be selected by Spike Lee to do this film. First and foremost, I always wanted to serve in the military. I went to military school all my life. And when I was 14, I had a back operation that prevented me from moving forward, passing physicals. So I get to pretend that I was in the military. Better than nothing. For Spike, it was very important to be as authentic as possible in telling the story. For him, it wasn't enough to recreate the backdrop here in Pasadena somewhere or at Warner Brothers lot. You know, it was very important for him to really capture the essence of what the Buffalo Soldiers went through in their campaign in Italy. At the time, the Germans were dug into Italy. They had already been holding fort for about 3 years, and they knew the land inside and out. So the Buffalo Soldiers had quite a big task on their hands, which was to uproot the Germans and push back the Gothic line, weaken their position, and hopefully enclose them back into Germany. And that was no small feat. The film starts off with the Battle of the Serchio River. And the Serchio River was a very tricky area because where the Germans had their position, it was elevated. So they had an eagle's eye view of anything and anyone that was coming in any direction. And for Spike, it was very important for us to fight at the actual location where this battle took place. He didn't want to spare any type of details. So we were out there for quite some time, and I remember while I was filming how uncomfortable the situation was. The terrain was, very unforgiving. The weather was very unpredictable, and all I could think of was, at the end of a 12-hour day, I have a warm bed to go to, and these men had to rough and bear it, hands down. So it just made me really appreciate those that came before me. Throughout the film, we had encounters with real Germans. Once again, sparing no expense. The Germans were played by Germans. The Italians were played by Italians. During our training in our boot camp, we would get ambushed constantly by the Germans. And it got to a certain point where we were allowed to ambush them in return, so that was a lot of fun. But just knowing, just having that uneasy feeling that you could at any point in time get ambushed, and we were getting shot by blanks. I mean, there was no threat, that our lives were in danger. But it really puts into perspective what each and every one of you, has had to go through in your lives. And it just made all of us take this story very seriously. So for me, it was something that I was very proud to do. I did one other war film before this one called Jarhead, where it was depicting the Marine Corps position in 92 Desert Storm. And both films were just as gratifying and done with just as much pride. If I could say one other thing, out of the 4 soldiers that this story revolves around, my character was the one that survived and made it to his later years in life. And it really made me realize how much of a loss people experience, those who do survive. It's bittersweet, to make it when so many of your brothers, your fellow men and women who fought valiantly beside you didn't get to make it. And so, with that being said, I tip my hat, I salute you all, and I thank you for allowing me to play this part. And I hope when you see the film, if you haven't seen it, that you feel we did a good job of representing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Now, I want to bring up a gentleman here. All right, this is George Edwards, who was Lieutenant George Edwards, and was in Italy in World War II in the 92nd Buffalo Soldiers. So we have here the real deal. And I thought it would be really great if he could to talk a little bit about it, and you can get a picture of the two gentlemen together.
so small here that I'm having a problem. But my first week in the Army, in the military, down in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, I had my first leave, and regrettably, some big guy came along and said, "Out of my way, Shorty." I took a chair, bent it over his head, broke it. When he went down, I made a mistake. I jumped on him, biting and kicking and screaming. A Mexican judge came over, and he sentenced me to pay for the chair, $1.02, because I was hostile. I was hostile. He put me, I had to spend a night in a Mexican jail, and the roof was about as tall as this building, and they walk along once a day, throw food over into the jail, and on Monday they do let you out. But this was on a Sunday night, so I spent one of my first half night. But as a result of it, I did make private first class, specialist third class, and then that 3 or 4 days later, after they took me out of jail to get back to the base. Then I made staff sergeant in 4 months. First sergeant for 9 months. In 11 months I was a master sergeant operations, S3, so forth. And in 1 year, I was a regimental sergeant major of the 369th Infantry. Now, the 369th Infantry were called the Fighting 69th. And in World War I, they went to French, and the French people, the French soldiers took them in because they had the ability to throw hand grenades like baseballs accurately. Therefore, every French unit wanted a Buffalo soldier. When the war ended, the French people brought them back to Washington, back to New York. The French government paid for a parade. There's one gentleman in here that works upstairs that remembers this to a degree, but they did honor them. They received a lot of medals. And they brought them back, paid for a parade, and they had a beautiful parade. Noble Sissel, Lena Horn was there, and quite a few others. But for my first place, in 6 months I'll be 90 years old, so when I say what I'm saying, you can recognize that, of course I'm practically senile, but there's some validity. I saw women were allowed to go. Now none of you men know what the freedom was, but for men, before women were allowed to go. But I did sell newspapers during that time. But I did stay in the Army. I did go over to Italy, and I did fight. And I had one experience that not too many can see. I was a first lieutenant then, and I was a battalion supply officer, 2nd Battalion supply officer. The Tuskegee Airmen became involved in a combination of foot soldier, airfield, and I had the experience in my Jeep and my driver and with some Bryson going up the front line, and looked off to the right, and the Tuskegee Airmen were coming around overhead, and of course we didn't know what the hell it was, so I went in the hole, and the other driver went in the hole, my Jeep went in a ditch. So that was my combat with aircraft. We got a lot of it. But here's the main thing I want to say now. We came back, we were treated like dirt. We were treated like hell in the United States. They sent us to Fort McClellan, Alabama for an American reorientation course. What the hell is a reorientation course? And a lot of other things that the gentleman brought out about the Tuskegee Airmen. We witnessed it also in the South. But when the Korean War ended, George C. Marshall, General MacArthur was fired by Truman. But George C. Marshall, who was the Secretary of State at the time, but during World War II, George C. Marshall was in charge of all the fellows. And but when he fired MacArthur said, I will not, very, very slowly, I will not take the blame for the Korean difficulty, for the Chosin Reservoir. I will not take that blame for the fighting that they did. And I want this young lady to know because she has some experience with the buffalo. He said they had the ability to fight like they went out with the Civil War, standing up in 300 or 400 troops, and they marched all the way up to Chosin Reservoir and had a big battle about having adequate supplies and adequate training. We would have lost if we had had the training of the VMI, of the Virginia Military Institute officers, who we got, and who we felt bad about. And our fighting was restricted for 60 years, 65 years, century, for 65 years. You can get it now, yeah, I know it's okay, you can show it now. For 65 years, but they were VMI graduates. Now, I should have, for years I had a bad feeling towards General Almond, or other generals, the officers. But now my bitterness is towards the VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, who trained those officers in the Soviet Civil War, and they still used it until the Korean War when General Almond marched his troops up there and they were all wiped out. All the Korean veterans know the real bitterness. Now, the colored troops were trained by West Point. West Point, not necessarily the best, but the West Pointers. The West Pointers learned from the British, very slowly. British learned from the Watusas. And if you've seen films of the British soldiers, and the Germans fought them, and the Japanese, and the Hungarians, all other countries fought them, but the Watusas taught them to the 3 C's of fighting, which we'll discuss a little bit in a couple of minutes. But the Germans used the VMI type training with a little front attached. But the Watusas taught them when they had they saw pictures of them, large, massive troops with spears and bow and arrows and all lined up and dancing, making a lot of noise. Supposedly drinking. They weren't drinking, but they weren't dancing. But what they were doing is that when they were doing this, they were digging holes in the ground and building tunnels and building traps. They taught camouflage, containment, and concealment. And they defeated the British. They defeated the British 3 times until the British learned when they came up there, they were all ready for them by having their own holes dug. But they would come out of the holes and shoot them in the back. And they were very successful. So we learned from the British, who taught the West Pointers, and the West Pointers taught us. When World War II came along, if you're any older than me, but remember the bonus march of World War I can remember. But some of you, a lot of your parents would. But MacArthur was fired and sent, as the chief of staff, was sent to the Philippines. Eisenhower was his second in command. And he was, so MacArthur got all of the older West Pointers at the time of World War II. Eisenhower got the younger West Pointers. General Mark Clark, who received severe criticism because he got the soldiers, Southern trained soldiers and Southern trained officers who still, as they say, fought like they did in the Civil War. And Mark Clark was seriously criticized for it. And what I have to say now is that my bitter feeling is gone, because I can't just really think of what happened to us with this treatment, but what happened to the British, there were the Indians, there were the Brazilians, there were the Jewish, there were the brigade, there was the Polish brigade, and they were all fighting under the direction of Southern trained officers. And vocabulary. Particularly at Sicily and the Montecito Casino. Thought of the climb the hill, you standing up instead of crawling. The West Pointers taught you how to fight. You crawled around, you curved, you didn't stand up. And Truman Gibson, in this article where you were involved, came out and said the colored troops ran. He was in the foxhole, in a cave with General Almond when there was an attack. The attack was successful because the troops had followed the 3 C's, and they had defeated the Germans. But if you look at the view from the rear where the Major General is, quite back, far back, he wanted to see the troops standing up. Well, they weren't standing up, but they were improving their positions after they had won the battle. On the battle. But they were there moving around, so General Almond ordered the Tuskegee Airmen who were in there helping in their attack to bomb them from behind, trying to force them to go forward when they were already there. That's one battle, and there's a book here, you see it, there's a book out there, the Buffalo Fort and everything. But that's something that was not known anymore. But also now, at the finish of the war, we were still under Southern control. Guard Seymour and so forth. We were put in boxcars. We all had 50 of the top colored officers. Well, first thing the War Department order was issued was that you would be lieutenants, regardless of position. Now, I'm a little guy, but like I say, I went to jail to fight for the big guy. I'll talk to him later. but they did mistreat us. But when you think of those others, the Polish, the British, the Brazilians, and all the others that were involved in the North Africa, Italian campaign under the BMI procedures that were killed unnecessarily. So I just want everybody to remember one thing, and I don't think any of you in here have seen a Purple Heart medallion. There's one upstairs, Purple Heart medallion. And it can be only given by a Purple Heart veteran. It's only the last 5 years we have them available. But a Purple Heart veteran of World War I or World War II. Not familiar. Why do it that way? It's a constitutional warfare. A warfare by constitution. The presidents, Wilson and Roosevelt, went to Congress. We got a declaration of war. We need our presidents to go to Congress and get that declaration before we stick our damn neck in somebody else's business.
What can I say after that? George is a tough act to follow. But we have one more speaker, but I just want to say that this program, at this point in time, is especially significant in light of current events and the changes that we have seen in our society. And I truly feel that for the first time, we really find ourselves closer to seeing Dr. King's dream realized. Our last speaker is Anne Evie, and Anne lived in Austria prior to the war, and after the Anschluss, when Germany took over Austria, she left and went to work for the Red Cross. And she came back when the Americans came in, the 761st Tank Battalion and the 92nd Buffalo Soldiers. Oh, and I wanted to point out, this is George's, the jacket that was given to him, and some of his hats. So I'd like to bring up Ann Hebe, and she can relate some of her experiences.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You are going to hear the other side now, in a way. Actually, it's such a lovely day to celebrate our colored troops and our heroes for the Second World War. That's already a special day. But for me, it's even more important because I didn't realize that I was hoping today, but I don't think anybody is here. I had a regiment in my home in Austria, and I mean fully and truly. The officers lived in the main castle, and the troops were on the grounds, in the park, in the rose garden. They put up tents, and the war ended, as you all remember, in May of 1945. And in Yalta, there was an agreement, which unfortunately I do not agree with. It was not very well done, but it was also unfortunate because President Roosevelt was quite old and sick, and Winston Churchill wasn't too young anymore either, and neither was Stalin. And when they started to divide up Europe, they did not do it all the way it really should have done, if at all. But anyway, the war was over, and according to the Yalta Agreement, Austria, as well as Germany, was divided into 4 parts. One was going to be governed, for 10 years by the way, was going to be governed by the Americans, one part. You may be aware of this, but you may not, but it is history, and I think it's very interesting. Another part was governed by the French. The third one was the British. And last but not least, the Russians. And that was the difficult part. As a matter of fact, they stayed the longest. We could hardly get rid of them. But anyway, they had divided up. We have 8 provinces in Austria. And they divided the provinces by whichever I just told you. The east was totally Russian, the Burgenland and Lower Austria, and the capital of Vienna, which was very hard for the people who lived there. Then came the Americans, and they had Upper Austria and the beautiful Salzburg. But Upper Austria, they made a horrible mistake. There was really a horrible mistake. They divided cities like my town of Steyr by the river Enns. On one part of the Enns River may have been an office of a doctor, but he lived on the other side of the river. And there was no way he could get back and forth. There was no way we could cross. And I will tell you right now a funny story, because I worked for the Red Cross. I was actually a volunteer hosted there because the Austrians always thought that the American Red Cross came for them. They didn't realize it was really for the Americans. Well, the girls who worked there were desperate. They couldn't understand them, and they couldn't communicate. So I had a little office, and it was for me very nice. We had hardly any food. And when I came to my little office, I was a big bowl of donuts and coffee. And in those days I smoked, and cigarettes. And it was really nice. I ate practically only donuts because I didn't want to eat the food away from my family. And I can't see a donut today because that was the only food I had. But I'll tell you a story what happened with the river. A river divided Russia from America. Well, the girls found out when they were in the Russian zone that it would be much more fun if they would be on the other side. So in night and fog, they swam across the river. And unfortunately, they also encountered soldiers who didn't really give their whole name. They just said, my name's John, you know. And then I would see them, and I would see them in my little office at the Red Cross, and they would say, you know, I am expecting, and I'm so happy, but you know, I don't know how to get in touch with my fiancé. So I would say, do you have his name, serial number, address, or anything? Hell, yes, I have the name. His name is John. And he was in the 92nd Regiment or whatever, you know. Well, that was really quite enough. And of course, 9 months later, there was a little black boy born. Very sweet and nice, but there was no father to it. So there were many different stories. I have one story that is really hard to believe, but it actually happened. You have to realize my home in Austria has been there since the 14th century. So it's been there a long time, and it has seen a lot of things. And the people who live there are very simple, not very well educated either. They farm the land, they're good people, they're nice. Now it's better these days, but we are going back 65 years, you know, when I talk about this. And unfortunately, they were not very worldwide. They didn't know, they had never seen a black person. That was a new thing to them, you know. So when they arrived and they were all in the tents around my home, they got to know them. And they went out and they had a little drink or something. And one day the girls, and I found it out in the Red Cross because they came to me and asked me. One day the girls would ask and say, how come you're so much darker than we are? Well, the soldiers thought, you know, maybe they should maybe a little bit not say the truth. And they said, well, you know, we are night fighters. and this one, the girl said, night fighters? Well, you see, when we leave the United States, this is the gospel truth, we are injected to become black. But this will eventually wear off, and then we'll be white. Well, the girls, you know, as I said, I don't think this would happen today. 65 years ago, they sort of bought this. And when I remember very, very well when I returned from my going away from the Russians, because we all fled to the West, so we could escape the Russian occupation. So I was in the Tyrol, but when we came back, I was looking out from the upstairs window. In drives a Jeep. Very handsome lieutenant with a whip in his hand, you know, gets out and says, could you tell me where my fiancé is? And I said, who's your fiancé? Gave the name of the girl, and I didn't know quite what to say, except the truth. So I said, well, I know your fiancé, but her husband just got back from the war. An Austrian boy, you know. So he thought about it. Then he said, well, I might as well stay with you here in the schloss, in the castle. I said, well, that won't work. I just arrived and I'm not set up for house guests. And you might go into town. I said, there's a lot of troops there. They will put you up. He came from another town, you know. Then he thought a long time and he said, I can't do that, I'm able. So that was pretty bad, and I said, the only advice I have then is, please turn around, go back to Wales, it's only 2 hours or 3, and you'll be home before nightfall. So these are the stories, but that story, by the way, has a very charming ending. The farmer who came back from the war accepted the black boy, it was a boy, and they had 2 more children. So there are 5 children in that household. 4 of them are white by the father, and 1 by the fiancé. The children grew up happy. They speak the Austrian dialect, and they led really a very Austrian life. And it was very interesting how they intermingled. And you see, when I grew up, I never realized that there was a problem in the United States. To me, people we were equal. And I couldn't understand when I was told through my American friends that a colored soldier was fighting the war and not allowed to eat in the same dining room. I didn't believe it. I couldn't comprehend it, you know. And so wonderful now. This is no more. This is all past, and we can only look forward, as you said, to a wonderful future where the color does make a bit of difference. I have to tell you how come I'm here. I mean, I am not living in Austria. You know how lucky I was? I found the man of my life, my husband of 60 years in Austria, but he married first American to come to Austria. And I do have to tell you because it's really a fairy tale story. And the matter of it was my birthday on the 6th of August 1945, when he was a colonel in the United States Air Force at that time, and he was a wonderful physician and in charge of taking over from the Russians the hospitals in Vienna. So they sent him up from Italy in a jeep with his interpreter, with his driver and his aide-de-camp. They sent 6 solid hours on my birthday, which we didn't know each other then, in August, and the Russians would not let him in. Well, finally they gave the laissez-passer. Well, the American soldiers were there with the binoculars hoping everything would go all right. He was the first American. So they drove through nothing but Russian territory, Russian occupied territory, and arrived in Vienna. Well, the Russians could not have been friendlier. The wine and the vodka and the whatnot was flowing, and he was wine and dine, and he was shown beautiful Austrian hospitals with everything intact, and said, this is what you are going to take over when you come around Christmas time. This was the arrangement to take over your part of the occupation. Well, little did they know when they came back around Christmas time, the hospitals were in shambles. Every single toilet, every single light bulb, everything was taken back to Russia. And what wasn't possible to be taken back was shot through. So my poor husband, whom I still didn't know, my poor husband stood there and said, what to do? I have to have a hospital for my soldiers. They had to put up tents. They could not do it any other way. They finally repaired the hospitals. This was the problem in Austria. In the months of January, when the Russians were in charge of the occupation in Vienna, the town was empty. All the Austrians fled. So it wasn't easy. Well, anyway, back to my fairy tale story. On St. Patrick's Day, which was a new day to me that we don't celebrate it in Austria, I met my husband. That was now March 17th of 1946. And we've been together for 60 years, and wonderful, happy years, and that's what brought me to America. And when we came to settle down about 47 years ago or so, he said, where would you like to go? I'd like to be in California because I am from California. And I said, well, as long as you bring me someplace where the orange trees bloom and the lemons and the sun shines eternally, and I'll be happy forever. And I am here in Palm Springs. I hope I will be able to go a little back and forth for a few more years to come. And thank you for listening.